Hi everyone, we're going to go ahead and do our last semester video over the role of government, the role of speech, and how they interact within each other. There are three main things that we have to recognize within this chapter specifically. First, free speech and the limitations in which we have. Second, the role of government with speech. And third, the concept of the Internet of Things. But let's start with talking about free speech and the limitations in which we have. As we all recognize, we are constitutionally guaranteed the right to free speech. But that doesn't mean that speech is absolute in nature. Things that are limited within and are not counted as free speech are obscenities, fighting words, defamation, including both libel and slander, child pornography, perjury, blackmail, incitement to lawless action, threats, and solicitation to commit crimes. Now, functionally, what this means is that outside of these things, we have the right to say anything that we want to. But the implications of that holds are going to be incredibly important when we look at how it allows for us to interact with the government as citizens. First and foremost, it allows for us to dissent. Since we have free speech, it gives us the opportunity to say what we want about the government in the fashions in which we do, as long as we are not being obscene and we are not inciting threats to the government. But even further than that, what we recognize is that the limitations that are posed are limitations for our safety. It's like when we talk about the social contract theory, which asserts that we give up specific rights to be given specific freedoms and specific protections. In this case, we give up the right to do things like say obscenities, blackmail people, perjure, incite threats. And in order to do all of this, what we actually get at the end of the day is a protection of free speech. It's like yelling fire in a crowded theater. You can't do this because it's an actual threat, and what it actually does is it promotes and puts people in an unnecessary amount of unsafe situations in comparison to just you not yelling fire in a crowded theater. But free speech does play another role, and it's how the government interacts with these rules and laws of free speech. Like we recognize with college campuses, there are a lot of speech codes that we have to abide by in order to not only maintain our studency, but also maintain our ability to just be on campus. Most of those things are consistent with the free speech and the limitations that are posed, but there are other specifics as far as not speaking poorly about the college, not like defaming the college in a way even if we believe that it is true, and things like that, which are technically protected under free speech, but are not protected under specific speech codes. That's kind of how the government works as well. Because they have to do things like regulate free speech, it puts us in a position where we have to understand their role and their operation. First and foremost, this role is by someone like the Supreme Court. Now, when we have the court cases that go to the Supreme Court talking about whether or not we should have to bake cakes for same-sex couples, that was presented originally as an issue of free speech because it is a presentation of what people can and cannot do, and since art is considered a form of free speech, this Supreme Court trial was heard under free speech limitations. But what we recognize is that it is ultimately the government's role to play and make this deciding factor on if something is or is not considered into free speech. But even further than that, they're responsible for maintaining the speech codes. So when we do have situations where things are being violated, the government ultimately has the say-so in which we have to recognize if something is or is not a part of free speech. Insofar as something like a campus protest that turns violent because they were inciting lawless action, like trying to fight the speaker and things like that, like what happened at Texas A&M a few years back, what we have to recognize is that the government's main role is to make sure that most of our free speech is preserved as much as possible. Which is when we then talk about the Internet of Things, which also plays into how the government interacts with people, with their communications, and with how everyone understands how they interact with the United States government. Now, the Internet of Things is defined as the interconnection of Internet of computing devices embedded in everyday objects, enabling them to send and receive data. Think about your Apple Watch, think about Alexa, think about all of these things that are all connected because of the internet. Now, the argument that is made and where the government comes into play is that the government is listening to all of these things solely because they're interested in maintaining national security. That's where the Patriot Act and the NSA come into play. Because of the Internet of Things, this observation has become significantly simpler for the federal government to do when it comes to playing the United States. Now, the arguments that they use are not only promoting national safety, but also maintaining and regulating free speech by making sure that there aren't speech codes that are being violated. But inherently, what we have to recognize is that the part of our privacy that we thought that we had is now being disrupted because of the Internet of Things. So when we take a step back and we look at the role of government within free speech and the concept of communications in general, we have to recognize that we do have the right to free speech, but there are limitations such as obscenity, defamation, perjury, blackmail, and true threats. We also have the role that the government does play within free speech, like maintaining free speech, but also regulating these speech codes. But then we also understand that their interaction has become on deeper, more interconnected scale through the Internet of Things and the observation of specific individuals for the sake of safety. So I hope it's been a great semester and I've really enjoyed talking about different parts of speech.